Welcome to this Heythrop Centre for Textual Studies colloquium on teaching and learning in the ancient Mediterranean, which we are calling Bookish circles. May describe us quite nicely as well. So I'm just really here to say thank you for coming and welcome. And it would be worth explaining how the question arose, because I haven't been able to hide the fact in my little blurb that I've written that this arises out of a New Testament-y question that comes from me trying to understand Paul's letters. And this debate that goes on about early Pauline churches, the churches of ancient Asia Minor and Greece in the sort of 40s and 50s of the first century, how literate early Christians were, to what extent Paul's churches were sort of Bible study groups, the question of whether we are projecting highly literate, bookish, modern Bible study onto first century contexts. And it raises all sorts of questions about not only levels of literacy, because we've talked about that for a few decades, but more recent publications in Jewish studies, classical studies, people are starting to talk about different kinds of literacy that have different social functions in different contexts. So we're moving away from this rather linear scale of the most literate to the least literate. And I have a feeling that still has to sink in to some extent in New Testament studies. But when I study the New Testament, I think of myself as a student of Second Temple Judaism, and I'm trying to read these texts in their first century context. But of course, I must always remain acutely aware of the fact that I stand in a Christian theological reception of New Testament texts of 2,000 years. So this reception is always whispering in my ears when I'm trying to understand the texts in their first century context. And the moment I try to understand them in their first century context, I also realize that I'm really trying to understand ancient Mediterranean contexts. So it seemed like a good idea to gather as many students of the ancient Mediterranean as possible to try to throw some light on these questions of literacy and different kinds of literacy, questions that we're seeing so adroitly addressed now by some of the classicists, the editors of the Ancient Libraries volume from 2013, Jason Koenig and his colleagues, and the Ancient Literacies volume from 2009. I think that's all that I need to say, really. Oh, we've got some noise outside there. Sorry. Yes, when I spoke to Jim Aitken on the phone a couple of months ago, he said you're in danger of being New Testament-y about this, in that you say, well, I've got a question about early church, so I'm going to look at all the other groups around as a background to the early church and see what people did, and then see what's viable for the early church. And so I admit that that's my tendency, and then I've tended to be slipping into that sort of problem in framing the conference like this, but I also am inviting the widest range of students of the ancient Mediterranean as I can in order to try to combat that problem. So this is my starting question, and I hope that we will end up leaving my starting question behind and finding light shone on more aspects than I had imagined in the first place. So that's really all I have to say by way of introduction, and I think Ingo Kotzebue will introduce our first speaker, Professor Stern, shortly, once he's got his microphone on. So thank you very much.